So today, we're going to do something a little different. We're putting a fundamental human faculty on trial, and that's reason itself. For centuries, it's been praised as our greatest strength, and at the same time, condemned as our most dangerous flaw. So, which one is it? All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with Descartes and his really radical project to rebuild all of human knowledge from the ground up. Then, we'll dive into the paradox that his ideas create, which is going to lead us to put reason itself on trial. We'll hear from both the prosecution and the defense, we'll call in some expert witnesses from psychology, and then finally, we'll ask the big question: have we even had the right defendant on the stand this whole time? All right, let's kick things off with the man himself, René Descartes. Picture this, it's 1619 and he decides to do something, well, something completely radical. He made up his mind to throw out every single opinion he had ever learned from anyone else. And his goal? To rebuild his entire understanding of the world completely from scratch, using only one tool, the power of his own reason. So, you might be asking, why go it alone? Why this solo mission? Well, Descartes was deeply skeptical of any kind of collective knowledge. He believed that books, which are just filled with the jumbled opinions of tons of different people, were often way further from the truth than the simple, straightforward reasoning that any single person with good sense could figure out on their own. Now, this wasn't Descartes being arrogant, thinking he was some kind of special genius. No, actually, it was the exact opposite. The entire foundation of his project rests on this one core belief, that reason itself, that basic power we all have to judge correctly and tell what's true from what's false, is something we are all born with in equal measure. And that single idea, well, it changes everything. But right away, this big idea from Descartes runs into a problem, a paradox really. If we're all walking around with the same amount of reason, then why on earth do we disagree so much? The incredible diversity of human opinion suddenly becomes this huge, confusing puzzle. And come on, this is a frustration we've all felt, right? You get annoyed, maybe even a little angry, when people defend ideas that you think are just completely wrong. It's not that you think they lack reason, but you just get this feeling that they're not using it correctly. And you ask yourself, how can they not see what seems so incredibly obvious to me? So, how did Descartes solve this puzzle? He had an answer. He argued that our disagreements don't happen because some of us are more rational than others. Nope. He said it's simply because we lead our thoughts down different paths and we focus our attention on different things. And that brings us right into the courtroom, because for every passionate defender of reason like Descartes, there's been an equally passionate prosecutor. It's time to put reason on trial. First up for the prosecution, they could call a pretty heavy hitter, the religious reformer Martin Luther, who was, let's just say, scathing in his critique. Now, it's important to note, his attacks were really aimed at the role of reason in matters of faith. But wow, his words are undeniably powerful. Okay, so this really gets to the core of the whole argument. The defense stands up and says our mistakes come from not reasoning enough. Then the prosecution fires back, no, you've got it all wrong. Our biggest mistakes come from reasoning too much. The defense needs to respond, and they bring out their star witness, the ancient librarian Eratosthenes. And just look at how brilliant this is. By connecting a few simple observations, the pace of a caravan, the sun hitting the bottom of a well, the shadow of an obelisk, and some basic geometry, he measured the circumference of the entire Earth with shocking accuracy 22 centuries ago. It's a pure, beautiful product of human reason. But the prosecution jumps up and objects. They say, hold on, Eratosthenes is a one-off, a rare exception. And for their Exhibit A, they bring up a much darker figure, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Kaczynski was, without a doubt, a brilliant reasoner, a certified math prodigy. And here's the prosecution's shocking claim. He didn't commit his crimes in spite of his intellect, but because of it. And you know, if you actually look at the opening of his manifesto, it's a chillingly well-constructed logical argument. The prosecution's point is that Kaczynski took a dark, pessimistic viewpoint, pushed it to its most logical conclusion, and then he acted on it. Okay, so things are getting heated. Both sides decide to call in their expert witnesses, experimental psychologists. The only problem, these experts are right in the middle of their own rationality wars, and you guessed it, their verdicts are completely contradictory. And you can bet the prosecution is feeling pretty good about this. See, since the 1960s, a whole branch of psychology has been developing these really clever experiments. They set up problems that look simple, but most people give confidently wrong answers. It's like they're victims of a cognitive illusion, which some psychologists argue proves that human reason is seriously flawed. Let's look at a classic example known as the Bjorn-Borg problem. A group of students was asked to rank the likelihood of these different outcomes for the tennis star. And get this, 72% of them said that outcome number 3 was more likely than outcome number 2. Now, logically, this makes absolutely no sense, right? It's impossible for Borg to lose the first set and win the match more often than he simply loses the first set. This classic mistake has a name. It's called the conjunction fallacy. It's this weird tendency we have to think that two specific conditions happening together are more probable than just one of them happening on its own. And this isn't just a one-off. This kind of flawed thinking pops up all the time in what's called conditional reasoning. You know, your basic if P, then Q statements. As you can see from this table, there are 4 ways to reason from a statement like that. 2 of them, modus ponens and modus tollens, are logically valid, but the other 2 are traps. They're classic logical fallacies. So what happens when you test people on this? Well, the results from tons of experiments are pretty clear. We are not consistently logical creatures. Sure, pretty much everyone gets the easy one, modus ponens, right? But only about 2/3 of us correctly make the other valid inference, modus tollens. And here's the real shocker. About half of all people fall for the 2 fallacies. Okay, at this point, if you were on the jury, you might be starting to fidget a little. You might start wondering, wait a minute. What if the problem isn't with us, the people taking the tests, but with the tests themselves? What if we've been putting the wrong defendant on trial this whole time? To really get what's going on here, just look at this famous illusion, Adelson's checkerboard. Let me ask you a question. Which square is lighter, A or B? The answer seems completely obvious, but it's a trick. I promise you, squares A and B are the exact same shade of gray. So why does this happen? Well, it's because your visual system is way more sophisticated than you think. It doesn't just measure the raw amount of light that hits your eye. It's actually trying to calculate something called reflectance, the proportion of light a surface bounces back. And to do that, your brain uses all this contextual information, like the shadow from the cylinder and the checkerboard pattern, to figure out the lighting conditions. Okay, so here's where it all connects, the big analogy. Being fooled by this visual illusion isn't a sign that your vision is bad. In fact, it's proof that your vision is working perfectly. It's incredibly well adapted to making sense of a 3D world. So, what if it's the same with reasoning? Maybe failing an artificial logic puzzle because you can't help but treat all the information as relevant isn't a sign of irrationality. Maybe it's a sign of a mind that's perfectly adapted to the real world. And all of this leaves us with one last, really provocative set of questions. What is this whole debate really about? Is the universal reason that Descartes was talking about the same thing as the narrow logical calculation that psychologists are studying in their labs? Is there even a real defendant in this trial at all, or have we just put a dummy on the stand mistaken for the real thing?